Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into forced resignation.
Yeah, it's a topic that we've seen a lot of people get caught up in, and a lot of times folks don't even realize they're in it.
Absolutely. And it's not as clear as just being, handed your walking papers or being, fired or whatever.
Right, right.
So let's break down what exactly forced resignation is.
Sure.
So imagine, you're working along, you're happy at your job one day and things start to shift.
Mm-hmm.
Your boss starts giving you a lot more work, or your responsibilities change, maybe even without your consent, or you're being criticized a lot, or even bullied.
Yeah, and that's where the line starts to blur between what is just voluntary resignation and what's legally termed constructive dismissal.
Okay.
So constructive dismissal is essentially when an employer makes the work environment so toxic or unbearable that the employee feels they have no choice but to resign.
So it's like they're being pushed out the door rather than being shown the door.
Yeah, it's a subtle but powerful form of pressure.
And in our research, we found that this happens more often than people think.
Oh, absolutely.
There was one case we saw where a senior manager was given only 10 minutes to decide between resigning or being fired.
Wow.
Talk about pressure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a very extreme example, and it really highlights the imbalance of power in these situations.
definitely. And employers, they might use a bunch of different tactics to kind of force an employee's hand.
Right, and we actually came across a template for employee resignation policies, believe it or not, and it actually outlines some of these tactics.
Really? So they actually spell it out.
Yeah, some of them were pretty straightforward, like demanding or even coaxing the employee to resign.
Wow.
But others were more subtle, like creating a hostile work environment through constant criticism, belittling, or even isolating the employee.
It's almost like they're trying to make the employee's life so miserable that quitting just seems like the only way out.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It's all about making that resignation feel like the only viable option.
And this is exactly why, we want to do this deep dive.
Absolutely.
It's important to understand what your rights are as an employee,
Couldn't agree more.
because we're going to cover, everything from identifying these red flags to the legal consequences for employers who do this kind of stuff.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, employees have the right to resign on their own terms. And forced resignation or constructive dismissal is a violation of that, right?
Exactly.
And it can have serious consequences for both the employee and the employer.
Okay. So let's talk about those consequences.
Sure. Fair.
From the employee side of things, what are some of the benefits or the things they might miss out on if they're forced to resign as opposed to just being terminated?
Right. Well, one of the biggest differences is severance pay.
Okay.
So in a lot of cases, employees who are terminated, they get a severance package, which can include, financial compensation, extended health benefits, even help with finding a new job.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you resign, even if you were pressured to do so,
Yeah.
you might lose all of those benefits.
So the company's basically trying to, avoid paying you.
Yeah, pretty much they want to cut their losses and make it your problem.
Wow. And what about unemployment benefits? Is that a factor too?
Definitely in a lot of countries, if you're terminated without cause, you can get unemployment benefits while you're looking for a new job.
Right.
But if you resign voluntarily, you might not qualify for those benefits.
Even if you're pushed into it.
Exactly. It
Yeah.
doesn't matter if you felt forced. The fact that you resigned could disqualify you.
So it's not just the money you lose right away.
Yeah,
It can affect you down the line.
exactly. And in some countries, there are specific laws that come into play.
Okay.
For example, in India, there's the Payment of Gratuity Act. It's from 1972.
Okay.
And it basically says that after 5 years of working for a company, you're entitled to a gratuity payment.
And that's like a lump sum, right?
Yeah, it's calculated based on your salary and how long you worked there.
So if you're forced to resign, could you lose that payment?
That's right. Resigning even under pressure could mean you don't get that gratuity.
That's a big deal.
It is.
Yeah.
Which is why it's so important to understand all the implications of forced resignation
Absolutely.
and really think things through before making any decisions.
Okay, so let's say someone's listening to this right now and they're thinking, oh no, I'm in this situation. What should they do? What are the steps they can take?
Well, the first thing is don't panic. Take a deep breath and try to assess the situation.
Okay.
Don't rush into a decision, even if you're feeling overwhelmed or threatened.
Right.
Take some time to really consider your options because resigning might feel like the easiest way out.
Right.
But there are laws that protect employees, and knowing your rights can really help you.
It's like a game of chess, right?
Yeah.
You got to think a few steps ahead.
Exactly. You need to consider all the possible outcomes.
Okay, so what's the next move then?
The next crucial step is to document everything.
Uh,
Write down every conversation, every email, any incident that you think is part of this hostile work environment.
so like dates, names, specific examples of what was said or done.
Exactly. That documentation is like your evidence. It can be incredibly helpful if you decide to take legal action later on.
So it's like building a case, right?
Exactly. And speaking of legal action, let's look at this from the employer's perspective for a moment.
Okay.
What kind of legal trouble could they get into if they're sued for wrongful termination?
Right.
Well, in a lot of countries, including India, there are laws against wrongful termination.
Mm.
For example, in India, there's the Industrial Disputes Act, and it lays out the valid reasons for terminating someone's employment.
Okay.
So employers have to have a good reason, and they have to follow the right procedures.
So you can't just fire someone because you're in a bad move.
Exactly. And if an employer is found to have wrongfully terminated someone, they can face serious consequences.
Like,
Well, they could have to pay fines. They might even have to give the employee their job back plus back pay.
well,
And then there's the damage to their reputation.
so it's a big risk for employers too.
Absolutely. This is not something they should take lightly.
So even in those at-will employment situations where employers have more leeway, forced resignation can still backfire.
Exactly. And that's why documentation is so important, even in those cases.
Right, right.
It gives you the evidence you need if you decide to take legal action.
This is all really important information.
It is.
Before we move on, is there anything else you think our listeners should keep in mind if they're facing this kind of pressure to resign?
You know, I think the most important thing to remember is you're not alone.
Yeah.
A lot of people go through this, and there are resources and support systems out there to help you.
That's a good point, because sometimes just knowing you're not the only one dealing with this can make a big difference.
Exactly. And there are organizations, both the government and nonprofit, that can offer guidance and support.
Okay, so where can people find these resources?
We'll be sure to include some helpful links in the show notes for this episode.
Perfect. So listeners, keep an ear out for those at the end of the show.
And one last piece of advice: don't let fear or shame stop you from getting help or standing up for your rights.
Right.
You deserve to be treated with respect and fairness in the workplace.
Absolutely. And that's something we'll be talking more about as we continue our deep dive into forced resignation.
Right. We'll be exploring more strategies for dealing with these situations and how to protect yourself both legally and emotionally.
So stay tuned for more.
We'll be right back after a quick break. Building on that, we should talk about the emotional impact of this.
Yeah.
It's not just the legal and financial stuff. It can really mess with your head.
Right, because it's not just losing a job. It's feeling like you were pushed out.
Exactly.
It's almost like a personal rejection.
Yeah, and that can lead to a lot of negative feelings, anger, betrayal, even shame.
So how do you deal with that emotionally?
Well, one of the best things you can do is talk to people you trust, friends, family, maybe even a therapist.
Yeah, have a support system.
Exactly. Just having someone listen to you can make a huge difference.
Right, it's like having a safety net.
Yeah, and it's okay to grieve the loss of the job. Let yourself feel those emotions, but don't let them take over.
It's easier said than done, though.
It is, but it's important. And sometimes, you can try to reframe the situation instead of focusing on the negative.
Mm.
Think of it as an opportunity. Maybe this is a push towards something better.
Like a new career path.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Maybe one that's a better fit for you.
Now, you mentioned at-will employment earlier.
Right.
And I think that can be a little confusing, especially when we're talking about forced resignation.
Yeah, it's a tricky area. So basically, at will means the employer can fire you for any reason or no reason.
As long as it's not illegal, right?
Right, like discrimination, that's still illegal.
Yeah.
But other than that, they have a lot of power.
So does that mean they can force you to resign and there's nothing you can do?
Not necessarily at will, gives them flexibility, but it doesn't mean they can do whatever they want.
Okay.
Forced resignation can still have legal consequences if they cross the line.
So again, documentation is key.
Always document everything. It's your best protection.
Now, what about the gig economy? With more freelancers and contractors, how does forced resignation work there?
That's a good question, and it's a real problem for gig workers because traditional employment laws don't always apply to them.
Right, because they're not technically employees.
Exactly. So they might not have the same legal options if a client ends a contract suddenly or creates a bad working environment.
So how can they protect themselves?
The most important thing is a good contract.
Yeah.
One that clearly lays out the work, the payment, and what happens if things go wrong.
Like a safety net.
Exactly. And for clients working with freelancers, communication is key.
Okay.
Be upfront about expectations, give clear feedback, address any issues right away that can prevent things from getting messy.
So good communication is important no matter what your work situation is.
Absolutely. And respect, too. That should be the foundation of any working relationship.
So to wrap up, we've talked a lot about forced resignation.
We have.
What are the key things you want listeners to remember?
I think the main takeaway is that forced resignation is a complex issue.
Hmm.
It has legal and emotional consequences. You need to know your rights, you need to recognize the warning signs, and you need to take steps to protect yourself.
And don't forget those resources we talked about.
Right, we'll have links in the show notes.
Exactly. So check those out if you need help.
And remember, even though it's tough, it's important to stay positive.
Yeah.
Forced resignation can feel like a setback, but it can also be a chance to find something better.
A fresh start.
Exactly, something that truly values you and your skills.
Now, we've talked about, a lot about when it's bad, right?
Yeah.
But is there ever a time when it's actually okay for an employer to encourage someone to resign?
That's a good question. And, there are situations where it might actually be better for both sides.
Okay.
For example, if an employee is not performing well, but they've been with the company a long time, the employer might suggest resigning instead of going through a formal termination.
So it's like a softer way to let them go.
Yeah, it helps them save face. And it can be easier to find a new job without a termination on your record.
Right. And it probably saves the company some hassle, too.
Exactly, especially in countries where the laws around firing people are complicated.
Yeah. So it can be a win-win.
It can be, but the key is that it has to be genuine.
Right. How can an employee tell if it's a real offer or if they're being pressured?
Well, communication is key. The employee should never feel threatened or forced.
Oh.
The employer needs to explain why they're suggesting this and what the terms are, like severance and benefits.
So get everything in writing.
Absolutely. A written agreement protects everyone involved.
Well, this has been a really interesting look at forced resignation.
It-
We've covered a lot of ground, from the warning signs to the legal stuff. What's the one thing you really want listeners to take away from all this?
I think the most important thing is to remember that knowledge is power.
Yeah.
The more you know about forced resignation, the better you can protect yourself.
And don't be afraid to ask for help.
Exactly. There are resources out there to support you.
And remember, we'll have links to those in the show notes.
Right, so be sure to check those out if you need them.
Absolutely. And, even though it can be a tough experience, try to stay positive. Forced resignation might feel like a setback, but it could also be an opportunity.
Yeah, a chance to find a better job, a better fit.
Exactly. Somewhere that truly values you and your skills.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive on forced resignation.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and remember, knowledge is your best defense in the working world.